It's always been the same. I stop, I look, I dream, but I don't take the step. History tells us that in times of war, many commanders have given their prisoners the task of digging huge holes and moving the dirt in sacks across the camp, then dumping that dirt out in a huge pile. Weeks of digging, moving dirt, hauling soil. And sometimes, just as the hole was dug, as the prisoners could muster some sense of accomplishment, some hint of purpose, the commander would order the prisoners to move the dirt back and fill in the hole they just dug. The epitome of meaningless work. I know I'm not in a prison camp, but right now my life feels like that. Work, buy, impress, whatever it is that day, I'm not actually accomplishing anything. I have no purpose. I am just digging, moving dirt, making a pile of what? I stop, I look, I dream of something more. It's always been the same, but not today. Today, I take the step. Today, I become more. Today, I realize I've made myself a prisoner. Today, I decide my status does not give me purpose. Today, I decide to love God rather than money. Today, I decide to pursue my Creator rather than success. Today, I return to my Father. Everything else is meaningless.
One of my, I guess you could call almost an addiction is ice cream. I love ice cream. And there's Baskin Robbins not far from my place. And we've kind of adopted the owners, become good friends with them, and my wife and I stop for ice cream any opportunity I have. And one of the painful things that I've observed with this pandemic that's going on is the effect it must be having on small business owners. I was in the week before last, probably about a week or a week and a half into this, and I asked the owner, I said, how is your family? And she and her family run 3 or 4 businesses. They're like extremely hardworking. She'll work 12 to 14 hours a day. And she said there's still people coming in, but she said everybody else in my family is home. All our other businesses have shut down. And she said she only hopes it, picks up. But there she was, running her ice cream store. And, the question is what's going to happen to her? As we're trying to wrestle with the enormity of the challenge and the social distancing, and many of us are stuck at home or working from home. The question of economics comes up, and we're looking around and we're going, how many businesses are going to survive this? How many churches are going to still be have the resources they need when they get back? All these questions. Rex Murphy writes for the National Post, and this is a quote from him regarding many of these little businesses that are often run or started by people who immigrate to Canada, and that's the case in this ice cream store. Extremely hardworking people. Rex Murphy writes, "The hurt that is being inflicted on so many, as I see the little they have worked for and built through the years of sacrifice, shattered and possibly fully lost, cuts to their soul. For them, this is a time of especially great mental pain. The crisis comes with two blades, the imminent threat to our health, and the cruelty is introduced to the lives of so many people. The stress they are under is near unimaginable. It is hard even to tell their story. It is perhaps just a mere gesture to do so, but I may hope that the telling offers an ounce of support for them." And we look at this kind of waiting game we have now. We watch the numbers, and we're hoping for what we call a flattening of the curve. The idea is that the stabilization of this pandemic and the start of a decline, and then the hope of how do we go back to leaving our homes, and what kind of testing is there, what kind of things, how long will this take, when will that happen? So as we wait, today's probably a timely message for you because the title of it is Waiting. We talked last week about embracing God and wrestling with Him, that our questions, it is not only something we can question God, but it's good that we wrestle with God, that there's a deepening of our relationship as we trust Him even when we suffer. This week is probably going to be if you didn't like last week's message, you're probably not going to like this one very much. But if you did find hope in it, this will definitely be the next step in the process. Like I said, your first step was, wrestling through and having that crisis of belief, but choosing to stay with God, choosing to be better, not bitter, and choosing to stay with God even though you don't understand Him or don't like what He's doing, or are furious that he hasn't intervened, even though we believe He's powerful and good. And we talked about that. This week is about what happens while we suffer and while we wait. We're talking about Habakkuk. He's one of the minor prophets from the New Testament, and Habakkuk is a man who in chapter 1 observed the injustice that was going on in his own society, and God said, well, don't worry, I'm going to do something. I'm going to bring this even worse nation in, and they're going to conquer and kill, and these horrible things are going to happen to our people. And then Habakkuk's going, that's not a great solution. Why would you do that? And he's wrestling with God through it, and so we kind of launch it off that place, and we talk about Habakkuk as he speaks or writes this book to the nation of Judah. And we're kind of going through this process of waiting. We hate waiting. We live in an instant gratification society, what many people called, but 20 years they started calling this the age of access. Anything you want, you can get. You can go on eBay or Amazon or whatever, and you can find the most obscure things from your childhood, or something that's hard to find, or a piece of electronics for your stereo, all these kind of things. And one of the hooks that the companies that sell these things is fast shipping, that things can come to you quick. We don't like waiting. We're kind of used to, I'm hungry, I can eat right now. I have a sugar, urge, I can go and do something about that right now. We have access to so many things. So we're not really good at waiting. And probably one of the things that is craziest about this pandemic is the fact that many of us are waiting and we're not comfortable with it. I saw a cartoon of a dog looking up at his owner and going, see, this is why I chew the furniture when you go. This is kind of that kind of time. So, wondering's no fun. Waiting can be worse, but it's an important step in where we need to get as we wrestle with God and as we find hope. So as we plunge into the points or as we start looking into how we're going to do this, we'll talk about 3 things you can do. Just because you're waiting doesn't mean you have nothing to do. In fact, the utilization of our time during the waiting period really determines how high you bounce back afterwards. And I can't underestimate this. So as we plunge in, follow along with us, and we'll go through these points. First step of what to do while we're waiting is the idea of listening. Habakkuk writes in chapter 2, verse 1, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look and see what God will say to me. Interesting, he says, I will look and see what God says to me. I take this as listening intently. It's not easy to listen when you're hurting. When we suffer, we often want to take control of our situations. My wife can often tell when I'm kind of struggling with something because I clean. And just cleaning gives me a sense of ownership or control over my circumstances. That, okay, I can make everything around me look good, then the world's going to be okay. And you probably have your own tells of what you do when you don't like where you are. Unfortunately, many of us make a lot of unwise choices during this time. Sometimes we impulsively make a major relationship change during a time of crisis. It's probably good to say, or it's probably wise to remember that when you're hurting and you're kind of like a hammer and everything looks like a nail. I heard a psychologist say this once, and it's true. Never make large, life-changing decisions when you're in crisis. Never make large, life-changing decisions when you're in crisis. And I'm not talking about, okay, I'm on these drugs, I need to get off them. That's obviously a change you need to make. But what I mean is I don't like where I'm at. Okay, I'm going to move, or I'm going to quit my job, or I'm going to quit school. I remember as a young adults pastor, I would often get students come to me and say they can't take it anymore and they were going to leave and they don't know what they're going to use this program for and all that. I often talked students into staying when they were in their third year final semester, February. It's like they had 2 months left and they were at that point wanting to leave school. And I was like, there's value in finishing what you're going to do, but they just don't feel right. They're out of shape. They're not getting much daylight. It's cold outside. They've been going hard. Courses are probably pretty heavy right now. And they look at all those situations and they go, okay, I need to make a change. And they see escape as appealing. Things that offer easy escape or distraction during times of crisis are often not good for us. And so what we should do in that situation is stop, pause, and listen. God often speaks to us in the silence. And his silence doesn't mean his absence. And then God often speaks to us when we're suffering. It may be a small encouragement, or it might be something that is expressed to us that we just need to hear at that instant. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, he talks about, it's a very raw book. I mean, it's just opening up his heart. And he's talking about what he called a thorn in the flesh. We have no idea what it is. Many scholars believe it was an illness he had, which was a little ironic because Paul prayed for so many people that were sick and were made well. And he begged God to take it from him. It says 3 times he asked God, take this thorn away from me, this thorn in the flesh. And God said to him, no, my grace is sufficient for you. And Paul said, God's power is revealed in my weakness. When I am weakest, I am strongest. When we listen, we understand that the waiting process isn't easy, but it is part of the process we need to go through in order to find the other side. And it means stopping and pausing when we want to take control and we want to make things happen. Listening is very important. I remember there's an account of Ronald Reagan when he was president of the United States in 1985, his second term. And a lot of people don't realize, but Reagan A lot of people thought he was really supportive of the military, which he was, but that he was a loose cannon and he was going to, start a nuclear war or whatever. But he actually was probably a bit of a closet abolitionist as far as getting rid of nuclear bombs. And he had some meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. And they had one particular conference that they were having, and it wasn't going well. And so finally the two of them with their interpreters took a walk, and they went and sat on a bench in a park, and they were talking. And Ronald Reagan asked a really strange question to a leader of a foreign nation, two superpowers that may seem crazy. He said to Mikhail Gorbachev, "Listen, Mikhail, if the United States was attacked by aliens, would you come to our defense?" And Mikhail Gorbachev thought about it. He said, "Yeah, actually I would. I would come to the defense of the United States if aliens attacked the United States." And he said, "Would you come to our aid?" And Ronald Reagan said, "Of course, I would come to your aid." And they both started laughing. And then it's like something came through them, and they started to talk to each other, and they started to listen to each other. And they actually began a process of taking down some of the unnecessary nuclear missiles they had and things like that. The second point is that we take time to write down what we're going through. You can do a recording or a blog or write in a journal about what you're going through when you're struggling. And this is actually very healthy. It's a great way to keep your thoughts organized and be able to see the steps you're going through. It helps us plan and achieve our goals as far as, okay, I was here yesterday, I'm here tomorrow, this is what I'm learning. It's a great stress reliever, and it also is a good reminder. One of the most painful books I ever read was called A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. He wrote the book right after his wife passed away. He was a confirmed bachelor for years, and in later life he got married, more out of convenience than anything. The woman he married was a friend of his who had a condition. I think she was struggling with cancer and was about to be basically let go from the country, sent back to America where she was from. And there was worry that this sickness and the trip would harm her, so he married her in order to keep her in the country. And these two friends actually fell in love, and they had a few years together, a couple of years, and then she died. And when she passed away, C.S. Lewis writes A Grief Observed, and it's a painful, raw book. It's very much the Habakkuk of the modern age, and he writes and he documents about his pain. And we see this process that he walks through as he goes through this, enduring this and struggling, and we see this evolving of his thoughts and his feelings as he documents things. It's surprising he published it because it was so raw, but he wanted people to be able to look and to be able to work through their own grief in a way where they would not lose God through their suffering. So it's valuable when you're going through suffering to take something to document or to express what you're feeling. Generals on the battlefield would often, after a battle, go to the wounded troops and ask them to explain, how they got their injury. And this is actually very therapeutic for people to say, okay, this is what happened to me. Whenever you go, or I'm visiting someone in the hospital, or you're visiting someone, and you say, okay, how did you end up here? What happened? To have them be able to express it is very, very healthy a very healthy part of the process. And so write it down, document when you're going through. So listen and write. The third step in the process of waiting is to actually wait. It's hard to wait. Sometimes inactivity causes us to feel the sense of panic as we want God to act, but when he doesn't act right away, we try to seize control back. And sometimes this causes us to do more harm, or actually take ourselves down a path that causes more damage than the actual original intention. It's hard to wait, because when you're waiting, you're acutely aware of your own powerlessness, but it's necessary. Anne Lamott wrote, "Hope begins in the dark. The stubborn hope that if you will just show up and try to do the right thing, the dawn will come. You wait and watch and work, and you don't give up. Habakkuk 2 and 3, this is Habakkuk on this. He said, "For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It will speak of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay." So it's just as sometimes the things that take the longest to prepare are the most meaningful. So waiting is actually an act that is going to bring out a better conclusion and a right conclusion, whereas our temptation is to just try to make things happen. This wilderness time is something every great spiritual leader and every great spiritual person in the Bible had to go through. Elijah was in the wilderness when God fed him and spoke to him. Moses was in the wilderness and had a period of time when he left Egypt before he went back to Israel. David had his wilderness wanderings when he was running for his life. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness. Waiting is actually a part, a necessary part, to navigating the world of suffering. In the early 1970s, Muhammad Ali and George Foreman were slated to fight in Zaire. It was called the Rumble in the Jungle, I think is what Muhammad Ali called it. And while they entered that country and they were preparing to do battle, in the training, George Foreman, who was expected to win the fight and was actually considered the hardest puncher in the world at the time, he was in training, and one of his sparring partners accidentally clipped George Foreman in the eye with his elbow and opened up a wound, a gash there that required stitches. And so the battle, which was imminent, had to be put off, and they had to wait 6 weeks for George Foreman's eye to heal up before the battle. Muhammad Ali was devastated when he found out that this boxing match was delayed. But in those 6 weeks, it's really interesting to watch his resolve. He started really low and discouraged about it, but he had this iron will and this determination, and he upped his training. And by the time the fight happened, it was actually ironic. It was shown. It actually, the battle in Zaire was at 4 o'clock in the morning, so that it could be on American television at like 10 o'clock, and the anticipation and everything, everybody expected George Foreman to win. He was considered a much better boxer than Muhammad Ali, but Muhammad Ali ended up fighting and battling through and actually winning that fight. There's a journalist who documents what happened after the first round, where both fighters were really showing their resolve, and Muhammad Ali had actually hit George Foreman a number of times, hits that would have put anybody else down, and George Foreman looked fine after that. And Muhammad Ali sat on his stool and he looked really uncertain and actually afraid. And then there's kind of this process he went through where his face started to change, and then this resolve took hold, and he stood up and he started putting his fist in the air, and the crowd started chanting for him. And a few rounds later, Muhammad Ali won that fight. Many scholars wonder if, or boxing enthusiasts wonder if he would have won that fight if the fight had happened earlier. Just a little advice while you're waiting. If it's not God's time, you can't force it. You can't make God act. And sometimes the way we act during a crisis seems to indicate that we think we can, but you can't. And sometimes it's time to sit back and do nothing. You know, you can listen, you can journal, you can improve yourself, you can pray, you can do all these things. There's a lot you can do. But one thing you can't do is resolve the issue by yourself and in your own strength. If you're truly suffering from something that is overwhelming and requires God's strength, it is going to require His timing. But here's a good news. When it is God's time, you can't stop it. It's going to happen. Aristotle writes, hope is a waking dream. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a man who ended up giving his life in the Second World War, a German theologian, wrote, the essence of optimism is that it takes no account of the present, but is a source of inspiration, of vitality and hope where others have resigned. It enables a man to hold his head high, to claim the future for himself, and not abandon it to his enemy. Remember that God's delays are not God's denials. Habakkuk 2 and 4 Habakkuk writes, "See the enemy," meaning Babylon, "is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his," speaking of God's, "faithfulness." Habakkuk 2 and 4. Or as we summate, the righteous will live by his faith. My faith isn't just a result I want. And I need to remember that. When you're in suffering, the world gets really small, gets centered around us. But when we're faithful to God, we recognize that there's a bigger picture. There's something going on that brings about far more than we could imagine in our own minds. It brings about this deep character. It brings about the goodness. We talk about the person who suffered through some horrible upbringing or something like that. I remember there was a man named Maury Blair who I heard speak. Maury Blair grew up in a house of horrific abuse, where his mother had an affair, and Maury was the result of that pregnancy. And he grew up in a home where her husband stayed around and hated Maury and abused him horrifically. And there was a time when he shared his story, and there was a psychologist there, and the psychologist came up to him afterwards and said, "Maury, you are a miracle." He said, "I've never seen anybody go through the horrific abuse that you've gone through and has actually grown up and lived a normal life." And Maury gave praise to God that is what he went through. Maury went through horrific abuse, and probably as a child had a lot of difficult questions, but he learned to trust the Lord. He came to Jesus Christ, and something greater happened. And it is incredible because Maury went all over North America, and people that had grew up in abused households just flocked to him, and a lot of them found healing. God brought something great out of his suffering. G.K. Chesterton writes, "To love means loving the unlovable. To forgive means pardoning the unpardonable. Faith means believing the unbelievable. And hope means hoping when everything seems hopeless." That's G.K. Chesterton. Habakkuk 2:20, he says, "But the Lord is in his holy temple." While he's waiting, you need to remember God's delays are not God's denials. He has something he's going to do in you and through you. Maybe we don't see a way through, but God can make a way. Maybe you're losing hope, but with the Lord there is always hope. Maybe you're hurting and afraid, but the Lord will never leave you. Habakkuk means wrestling and enduring. But remember, if it's not God's time, you can't force it. But when it is his time, you can't stop it. Last week we talked about the wrestling and the embracing. This week we talk about the waiting. When I was a young adults pastor, we had a man in a wheelchair, a young man in a wheelchair, come and do a presentation at the group. And when he was 17 years old, he had dived into a pool and broken his neck and become paralyzed from the neck down. And a wonderful man. He was 33 when we had him come in. And he talked to the College and Careers, and he talked about how deep his faith was and how much he learned and loved God, and spent so much time encouraging and praying for people and going around doing presentations. And he said something really funny that stood out to me. He said, "You may not believe this, but I'm actually thankful that I'm in this wheelchair. Because if I could still walk and do all the things, and I look back on my life when I was 17, there's no way I would have the depth and the closeness to God that I have now, when I can spend so much time with him and pray for him. And I can't believe the impact I'm having in the world." In a way, he said, I don't want this to sound twisted, but I'm actually thankful that God brought me through that. And I know there'll be a day when I'm with him, when I can run and leap and do all those things again. Remember, God's delays are not God's denials. He's with you. Let's pray. Father, as we're on this journey, this is necessary. These are necessary steps. The wrestling and the embracing, the questions of week 1 and into the listening and the documenting and the waiting. These are all part of the process of us enduring hardship, just as Christ did on his way to the cross. So, Father, we pray that during this time, this pandemic, that you would be with us. Give us strength, Father. Give us what we need to go through this with patience and faith. Help us not to force things, but instead to look to you and recognize that your timing will bring about things. We carry heavy burdens, God, lost jobs, lost opportunities, lost investments, lost opportunities to connect with people, struggles in marriage and finance and raising child, struggles in our faith. God, as we navigate this together, help us, Father, that as we go through this, that you would maintain our strength, our focus, and our faith. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, that concludes week 2 of our Habakkuk series. You are not going to want to miss next week's message. It really is the way everything has been centered and is heading towards this direction. And you're going to find out about something. You're going to be taken aback at first about what we do in step 3 in the valley, but you're going to, I believe, be super encouraged. And you're going to come out of that message just ready to take on the world. I firmly believe that. So thank you for being with us, and thank you as we go through this process. We're trying to help you. We're trying to help people. We recognize that a lot of people have fear and anxiety, depression. They're cooped up. They're struggling. There's mental health issues. There's family issues. There's all these things happening. And I just want to let you know I'm very proud of you as a church, and we know you're hurting, and we're trying our best to point you to the Lord so you can find strength in him. While you're not with us as far as the church services and things, you do matter. You're precious to God, and our contribution to helping you is to point you to the Lord and help support you in that. So thank you, and we hope you've been inspired today. Don't miss next week. It's going to be a good one. God bless. Thanks.